We hate that she will not be able to join us, but we are glad that we are here with you. So this morning, we're going to focus on planning for instruction using the 2024 ELA standards and how we can bundle some of those indicators and create some cross-content connections. Now, this is particularly relevant to our elementary level because most of you are generalists in that you are teaching everything all the time, all at once, right? So we want to help you to recognize and develop some bundling patterns to support your instruction in these elementary classrooms. Before we get started and too deep into our discussions today, we do have a new disclaimer that we need to share with you as we launch our session, and it's about the use of artificial intelligence during our session today. So oftentimes when we have these webinars, we'll see sometimes something pop into the note catcher or into the chat that discusses the use of an AI note catcher. I'm going to share with you the statement from our agency. We are not allowed to host our webinars anymore with those AI note catchers capturing or recording any of our content. So if you have any of the AI note catcher devices attached to your account or using that today to capture your notes, if you'll please disable that, we would really appreciate it. All right. A little housekeeping as we get started today. First, introductions. Well, hello, good morning. Hopefully you have met me before, but my name is Mandy Hawker, and I am the Elementary ELA Education Associate on our standard side of our office. With me this morning, I have Brenna McCormick, who also works in the Office of Assessment and Standards, and she is our middle level Education Associate for ELA. And we are happy to be your hosts this morning. Any questions, concerns, or confusion you might have, if you will just drop it in the chat, and Brenna will be there to answer your questions and support you in any way that she can. As you are getting accustomed to being in this virtual setting, if you will introduce yourself in the chat. What I'd like to hear from you is your name, the grades or grade band that you support, and then where you are in this state of South Carolina. Or maybe abroad. We've had some North Carolina attendees before. So please let us know who you are in the chat. Additionally, Brenna's going to drop into the chat our note catcher, which will also act as our landing page for today. Now, she will pin that note catcher into the chat so that if you need it, it's pinned at the top of the chat box. But that note catcher will be a forced copy. And it'll include all of the different places where we're going to ask you to interact with something today or interact with our session. It'll also contain any relevant links to resources you might need throughout our presentation today. And then finally, the last little note for housekeeping is that all of the instructional strategies and suggestions that you'll see referenced or suggested today, all of those are to be used in conjunction and in support of your high quality instructional materials. And we know that in South Carolina, we are so blessed. We have 5 different adoptions throughout our state for the elementary level. So whatever that high quality instructional material is, we hope that you use these resources in support of those today. All right. Now, another aspect of our virtual webinars that we find really beneficial to our stakeholders is the offer of recertification credit. If you are interested in recertification credit for your attendance with us this morning, we will offer 2 hours of recertification credit for this session. In order to earn that, we ask that you please attend live and participate in our session. There'll be instances throughout the chat or being able to unmute and share. We'd love for you to participate. We also ask that you remain in attendance for the duration of our time together, because at the very end of our session, you'll be asked to complete a feedback form that will capture your email and all of your feedback information, and that's how we will issue your recertification credit certificate. So again, if you're interested in that, just make sure you stay till the end so you can get that feedback form. Now that all that housekeeping's out of the way, let's get started taking a look at today's purpose. We have 2 purposes in our time together today, and the first is to explore the research and evidence for bundling indicators and creating cross-content connections. Why is it important? And then the second purpose is we're going to provide some instructional structures to support the bundling of those indicators and creating cross-content connections. As you think about those purposes, what I'd like for you to do is in box 1 of your note catcher, capture your thinking about today's purpose. How do you feel this aligns with why you chose to be here on a Wednesday during April? Some of you may be on spring break, some of you may be gearing up for SC Ready season, but let us know on your note catcher what your purpose is for being here today. Go ahead and take about a minute to respond. Again, if you need that note catcher, Brenna can drop that into the chat again. As you feel comfortable, you can also drop your purpose for being here today into the chat, just so we can kind of see what your intention is for being here and how we can support that purpose throughout our time together. Again, I'd love for you to drop into the chat maybe what your purpose is for being here today, or which of the purposes that we shared you find would be most beneficial to you today. What do you hope to gain? What do you hope to explore? Brenna, you make a great point with what you put into the chat about hearing how we're already bundling indicators across our state. One of the great benefits of being in these webinars that are statewide webinars is you get to hear how maybe things are being done in different areas across the state, from Oconee to Horry to Allendale to Jasper. I love being able to hear what other people are doing across the state. And then understanding of how to bundle the ELA standards. Yes, we'll get into really get into that in depth today. Oh, and teaching third, fourth, and fifth grade in co-teaching and how to make those connections. Excellent. Oh, and integrating cross content with social studies and science. And while we may not be able to teach the full extent of those social studies and science standards and indicators, we are able to provide an entry point to our students for some of those cross contents. All right, awesome, great. I love seeing your purposes, and that gives us a place where we can lean in and make sure that we focus and really drive home those points as we're going through. You'll notice in our time together today, as we look at our agenda, that our time will be broken into 3 parts. First, we're going to do an overview of what bundling indicators looks like. Then next, we're going to explore some instructional structures and do a little collaborating. And then finally, we're going to have some clarity and closure to our session together today. So, first, as always, in these sessions, we always want to point back to what the ELA standards document says. So let's take a look at this quote. This quote comes from the explanation of strands on page 20. Go ahead and read that quote quietly to yourself. The explanation of strands makes it clear that the intent of our ELA standards is not to teach them in isolation, but to group and intentionally teach indicators based on their need and the relevance at that time. In other words, not all indicators require a separate lesson, activity, or resource. So it's up to the educator to purposefully plan how we can bundle indicators to yield the effective and efficient results. With that in mind, what language from this quote kind of stands out to you? Are there any phrases or words that really make you think, if the standards document says this, it must be pretty important? Not taught in isolation. Yes, yes, I love that. Critically and engaging with others. In clusters. I love these quotes. Yes. My favorite part of the quote is that they are determined by the educator. How about that? Hallelujah. Who is the expert of those classrooms? The educator. And that person makes the decisions for how to bundle or cluster indicators for instruction to best support the students in their classrooms. If you've been with us any and we've discussed vocabulary, that's been a huge point of our discussions. In fact, our office hours tomorrow about vocabulary is going to talk a lot about that. How we teach the educator needs to determine the direction of how those indicators are taught. All right, let's move on from that quote. And now let's take a look at the definition that we have for bundling indicators. It says the intentional pairing or connecting of indicators across standards, strands, and or disciplines during an instructional experience, lesson, or unit. When we think about this, what does intentional pairing mean? How can we as educators ensure that we are being intentional in how we're bundling? And bundling indicators does not mean we are teaching each expectation to mastery. Like I said a minute ago, some of our science and social studies and even our math content can be integrated or bundled with our ELA standards, but it doesn't mean that we're teaching those science, social studies, math, arts, PE standards to mastery. We may just be giving students an entry point into that content. All right. Now, another point that I want to point out is that we are bundling or connecting indicators across standards and strands. So within our ELA standards, that might be bundling several AOR indicators or several communications indicators into one lesson. But that also might mean within ELA that we're connecting a reading indicator and a writing indicator and an oral communication indicator and a research indicator. So we're going across strands. When we connect to other disciplines, we know that that means that we're looking at connecting to cross content areas. Now let's take a look at the three scenarios defined for bundling. The first bundling scenario would be within ELA. Now, this is something that we typically see because we know that ELA is an interconnected subject, right? So when you're doing your reading, you're also doing your writing. Or when you're doing your research, you're also creating some oral communication. So we've shown this in several of our past webinars with communications and research of how to bundle indicators within ELA. Additionally, you can bundle ELA with another area. Perhaps you have an oral communication indicator that pairs nicely with a social studies indicator. So you have students create presentations on a historical event or a historical person. But the most sophisticated and of all the bundles would be those that are within ELA and another area. That means that we're targeting several ELA skills at one time, in addition to touching on another content area. Those are the ones we're going to scaffold toward during our time together today. These include 2 or more ELA indicators, as well as an indicator or standard from another area. These require a sophisticated knowledge of how the ELA indicators work together with another sophisticated level of knowledge of how that you all possess as elementary generalists who knows other content areas well as well. So we're taking our ELA knowledge and pairing it with another content area knowledge. Oftentimes for our middle and secondary teachers, we see that this is an area that they kind of hesitate towards or struggle with because they are content area experts, right? They are ELA experts. But with elementary generalists, we see this as a area where you typically are able to flex into easily because it is something that we do every single day. All right. Now let's take a look at what this means within or across subjects. So within one subject, that would mean combining strands. So teaching applications of reading alongside communications, teaching research alongside foundations of literacy. And you would be using your receptive and expressive modes of communication. So you'd be receiving information and expressing information. That's how it would be done within one subject. When we look at it across subjects, we often see ELA supporting other content areas. We see a connection to disciplinary literacy, and we often see arts connections being created. When we take a look at receptive and expressive understanding, let's take a look at these definitions. Receptive would be understanding what others say or write. Expressive would be using language to communicate your thoughts and needs. When we talk about bundling indicators for instruction within ELA, we need to remember the receptive and expressive nature of ELA. So let's consider the 4 strands of our 2024 ELA standards. When we consider the foundations of literacy, those are typically those skills that are attached to phonemic awareness, phonics, print concepts, and fluency. There are receptive skills like understanding the identification of phonemes and words and decoding the alphabetic code, right? But there are also expressive skills within foundations of literacy, like the encoding of sounds in words and reading fluently. Within applications of reading, the reading, identifying the central idea or the theme, those are things that we see as receptive skills in the applications of reading. But summarizing, evaluating, critiquing a theme, determining the meaning of figurative language, those are more expressive skills where you're having to express the learning that you've received. Within research, when we think about receptive and expressive, receptive skills in research would be the actual inquiring and refining that knowledge, right? Asking those questions and gaining the information. But the expressive skills of research would be developing a research product. And then finally, when we think about communications, where do you see receptive skills in communications? What are we receiving as receptive skills in communications? When I think about receptive skills in communications, I think about C 8.1 and C 9.1. Both of those indicators and standards focus on listening to the ideas of others, reviewing and taking in that information. Now, it's easy to see the expressive nature of the communications indicators, right? Right. We are generating writing. We are expressing our ideas. So it's very clear to see the expressive side of those indicators. Now take a minute right here. You'll see on box 2 of your note catcher, there's space for you to take notes. If any of this information is new to you, or if any of this information you feel might be relevant to discussions that you might have in your schools or classrooms, go ahead and jot any of that down. And think about the receptive and expressive natures of the standards that you've seen in your classroom. Now let's get to a more practical level. We've talked kind of cerebrally about the receptive and expressive nature of our standards and what ways we might bundle our standards and indicators. But now let's talk about what that might look across subjects. Now, these three scenarios are probably things that are pretty familiar to you. We often see bundling across subjects in three ways. The first would be through a theme. Now, all of you have those instructional materials, and oftentimes you will see themes presented in those instructional materials, right? It'll be like school community or explorers. Those are themes that are presented to us, given to us, and they are themes that we would teach through. Now, with those themes, we're often giving students a taste of some kind of content area knowledge, but the real focus is on the ELA standards and indicators. The next way that we often see bundling through across subjects would be by using projects. Projects as part of the elementary classroom are highly recommended as a way to make sense of information in children's lives. They are ways that we can naturally combine the skills of ELA alongside another area of content. And then finally, we see bundling across subjects through real world situations or problems. So in science, you may ask, well, how do plants and animals survive in a difficult habitat? You would create a real world problem for the students to solve. Or in math, how do we use numbers to measure and compare? In reading, how do authors use different types of text to convey information? All of those are problems that can be presented to a student for them to solve using their content area knowledge along with a different subject. So, which of these ways of bundling feels familiar to you? And then which do not? Go ahead and record that in your note catcher or in the chat. Do you have any experience with bundling in these three ways? Let me know. I'd love to see your responses in the chat. And I agree. Yes, through a theme, I feel like was something that was oftentimes not forced upon me, but really, really pushed in the classrooms that I supported. Through a theme, yes, is built into our instructional material. I love that most of you feel like you have familiarity with all of these. And then often we do see using projects, especially at the early childhood level, we see projects used a lot with family projects or different projects that you may use to integrate some of those different content areas. Oh, and Sandy, I love that you mentioned about the STEM background. Yes, a lot of research goes into support the use of STEM in creating some of these projects and often solving those real world problems too. Great. Okay. Well, I love that you all are pretty familiar with this format because this is where we're going to lean into a lot of those instructional ideas and support. So, one apprehension that we often get to bundling indicators is, what if my grade level is departmentalized? I only teach ELA and social studies, or I don't teach ELA at all, I teach science and math. Well, if your grade level is departmentalized, you have two avenues for how you might support bundling for your grade level. The first is through content. So we know that writing and reading are easy ways to integrate bundling in any content area. So if you are a separate math and science teacher, there are aspects of the content that you teach that must be integrated with writing and reading. Now, if you have very strict rules about how you are departmentalized, you may consider Bundling indicators or creating connections to content areas through the expectations that you have for students. Now, these are often shared expectations that you have in common throughout all of the different contents at the grade level that you support, and they are content neutral. Let's take a look. I bet you know what expectations I'm talking about. Anybody in the chat want to make a guess before we go to the next slide? What expectations do we have in the standards that are shared and common? They're often what we call the business of how we do ELA. One way that we see this done in our ELA standards is through the overarching expectations. Yes, so if you're familiar with our ELA standards, you know that the overarching expectations are the business of how we do ELA instruction. However, when I look at these, to me, they look like they could be overarching expectations for science, social studies, math, health, art. Because in all of those subjects, are we reading and writing for a variety of purposes? I think we're reading math problems and we're writing science reports. Are we acquiring, refining, and sharing our knowledge? We're acquiring knowledge in music when we learn about different composers or the way music is developed. Are we making inferences to support our comprehension? In health, do we have to infer information about healthy and non-healthy foods or the effects of alcohol and drugs? Do we have to collaborate with others and talk to each other? Do we have to cite evidence and explain our reasoning? Well, yes, especially in science and social studies. We want to cite our evidence in social studies back to those primary sources. And then are we creating quality work? Are there certain ways that a science report has to be written? Yes, absolutely. So our overarching expectations are one way that we can bundle the expectations for all of our different content areas. Now let's take a look at a piece of research. Background knowledge plays an enormous role in reading comprehension. Now, this is quite a simple generalization, but it makes a great connection to something I know our kindergarten through third grade teachers are pretty familiar with here, the reading rope. Background knowledge is one of the important strands in the language comprehension piece of our reading rope. And bundling indicators gives students access to background knowledge in a variety of subject areas. When we take time to intentionally plan and bundle indicators across subjects, we're getting students access to background knowledge that will allow them to enter content more prepared, more readily. So let's go back to that. Background knowledge plays an enormous role in reading comprehension. If we are making those intentional connections to science, social studies, math, health, art, we're giving students background knowledge to enter reading comprehension ahead of the game. All right, now we're going to do a little virtual turn and talk to end this first section together. The first thing I'd like for you to do is for the first 30 seconds, I want you to respond to the prompt in the box. Here is the prompt. What is one piece of information from this section that you would take back to your school or district to share? So everyone in the chat, please respond to that prompt. What is one piece of information from this first section that you would take back to your school or district to share? Oh, I love some of these answers. Yes, y'all. Oh, you're giving me points to add to my presentation for if I do this again. Um, Connecting to our related arts teachers and reinforcing the OE to them. Talking about the receptive and expressive natures and how those support other content areas. So the second part of this virtual turn and talk, I hope I don't ruin it by reading all of your comments and commenting on them. What we'd like for you to do is to go through and add or connect to a response that you see into the chat. So we should have about 31 responses in the chat. I want you to find one and respond to it. Um, you can say, yes, I connect with this. Yes, I argue that this is important, or if there's another connection that you want to make. But we'd love for you to add or connect to a response you see in the chat. This is one way that our team tries to build interaction in some of these virtual settings that are a little less easy to build engagement and interaction. So we hope that you will take the opportunity to respond to someone across the state. Amber, I love that you feel like you can take this and use this in your PLCs. Yes, everything that you see today, we will share with you for you to go back and recreate this with any audience that you support. So if you're a school level or district level coach, you're welcome to take any of this information, our slide decks, our note catchers, everything, and go back and do this with your teachers. I love seeing their response about the importance of vocabulary and background knowledge. So often we are able to develop students' vocabulary and background knowledge through the bundling of indicators. So I'm glad you saw that connection. Oh my gosh, co-teaching next year. Oh, yes, working together as one. Mm, I love that. Okay. Oh, I see such great comments in the chat. Thank you for engaging with that and giving yourself time just to kind of make some connections across the state with other leaders and really intelligent people. The biggest wealth of knowledge that we have in this session are you all in the chat sharing with each other. So I'm thankful to see the way you're interacting with each other. All right, now it is time for us to move to the actual instructional strategies, right? I want to see what this looks like in the classroom. So we're going to move into section 2, and this is where we're going to dive into those instructional practices and collaboration. Now, before we dig into this, I would like to say that all of the things shared in the next 15 slides are examples, not exemplars. Now, we're pretty explicit when we share things like this because these are just examples of how we have seen the bundling of indicators achieved in classrooms across our state, but they're by no means the exemplars or the only ways that this should be done, right? You all know that you are in classrooms every day and you see great examples of instructional practices that support the bundling of indicators. So if there's anything that you see that makes you think of something you've seen in classrooms, drop that in the chat and share it with us. I'd love to see your ideas as well. So let's start with those themes. The first way of bundling indicators that we talked about was in themes. Now, this is the back of one of your high quality instructional materials. Anybody recognize this one? I bet you do. Yes, into reading. So when we look at the back of those teacher manuals for into reading on the left, you see all of the themes for each of your modules. Now, those are designed in a way that they do create a bundling of sorts throughout those several week-long modules, and background knowledge and the vocabulary of content areas are integrated into those themes for you. Now, in some places, what we have seen in all of the instructional materials is that they aren't tied directly to the grade level science, social studies, health, music content for that grade level, right? So like, I think an example is that in 4th grade, they study early world history. Well, some of the themes and contents that are integrated are maybe like from later world history. So the connection's not as straightforward as we'd hope. So that's where your expertise as the grade level expert comes into place, where you need to see how those bundles align and how those themes align to the things that you study in your content areas. However, this is one way that's already done for you. It's provided to you, right? Now, on the right-hand side would be, this is more of a traditional way we see, especially in early childhood, of creating a theme where you have the theme of nature. And then all of the surrounding ideas around nature are things that you might do in an early childhood classroom around nature. You may do a make trail mix. You may paint with twigs. You may do dramatic play with camping. Now, all of those sound like pretty fun activities, right? But how many of those theme activities are standards and indicators aligned? That's where our apprehension lies. Often themes are a great entry point for bundling indicators, but we have to ensure that they are indicator aligned. So let's take a look at one that is. The theme here, this is a lot of information on the slides. I know it's probably eye fatigue to look at, but the theme here is all about America. This would be a second grade theme. So for ELA, we have two standards that we would be focusing on. AOR 5.2, which deals with text features. So we would need some text all about America that included text features. We have two research indicators, one that deals with asking and answering questions and one that deals with sequencing information from a provided source. So for that, we would need some all about America texts that gave students information about the history concepts, because the social studies history indicator that we're focusing on here is identifying and comparing significant historical events, moments, and symbols in U.S. history. So we could easily provide students with texts that include information about those historical events, moments, and symbols. We could allow them to research and read about those, and then we could have them use text features to learn more information about America. Now, the overarching expectation that we focus on here would be acquiring, refining, and sharing knowledge through a variety of multimedia literacies. So the culminating project here would be that students would create some kind of product, maybe a slideshow or a presentation of sorts about a historical symbol. Is this a theme that you feel you could recreate for second graders in your classroom? So this is a very simple way of what it might look like to bundle indicators for a theme. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is there's not a lot of direction over what does the product look like, what does the scope and sequence of this look like, what does the timing of this look like. So a lot of those details are kind of left up to the teacher in the classroom. Oftentimes, that's why we see those built into our high quality instructional materials so explicitly, given a number of lessons and a number of weeks to teach it in, right? Oftentimes, themes are a little more difficult for teachers to create themselves in their classrooms. It's often that we are given themes in which to teach under. So let's pause and ponder about the idea of teaching bundled indicators through themes. I want you to complete one of the following sentences in the chat. So, understanding bundling indicators with themes changed my perspective. How? Bundling indicators through the idea of themes made me more aware of blank. Or what is something you're considering as a result of looking at just bundling indicators with the idea of theme? We're only thinking about theme right now. Go ahead and drop that into the chat. For me, I would say that I'm more aware of the idea that bundling indicators through a theme is a little more open-ended and a little more difficult. I don't know exactly what the product might look like. That's kind of, and I don't know the timing. I don't know the scope and sequence. So bundling per theme would take a lot of planning on my part as the teacher. Jennifer, I love your comment about if we're going to focus our attention on bundling indicators through a theme, a great starting point is our instructional material. Now we know that that's not our ending point though, right? Right, because we have to ensure that the things presented in that theme align to our grade level content. Woo, and that's a challenge. Oh, love that, Denise. Yes, I was hoping we'd have an IB representative here. Brenna, you spent a lot of years in an IB school. Can you talk to us a little bit about the themes of IB and how you see the bundling indicators with that?
I think it definitely is just a prime place to bring in some of the within and standards, those cross content connections, getting all the teachers involved in um, even project based learning and learning that incorporates real world scenarios. Definitely a great opportunity to get students engaged in maybe some authentic learning opportunities.
Awesome. Thank you, Brenna. And as I see your comments in the chat, I really respect that you see that, yes, themes are created for us in our instructional materials. However, it's up to us as the experts to ensure that those themes align with our content area expectations and indicators. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Now let's move on to our next way of bundling, and that is through projects. Now, I'm going to share with you just 3 simple projects that I've seen done across our state that modeled a great way of bundling indicators through projects. Now, first, and Brenna and I were talking about this just the other week, her daughter's school is creating a recipe book. And so they're creating a recipe book throughout the entire school. It's a project where they're writing those informative pieces of the how-tos, and they are including aspects of their culture in the recipe book. So it's a great way of doing a project. You're doing a lot of those communication indicators for ELA, but then how are you tying in your cultural content and connections? So a great example would be a recipe book. Now, the second example is one that I bet some of you are in the middle of right now. Science fair projects. Woo! Don't we love those? So oftentimes we see science fair projects being a great project for us to bundle indicators. We see a lot of research indicators tied to this, as well as writing indicators. So our students are being asked to do those 2 skills for ELA and then generate those based on the science process. And then the third example would be a wax museum. Now, any reactions in the chat? Any of y'all familiar with a wax museum? So students are, yes, awesome, great. Great. I love that some of you have those experiences. This was always my favorite project in 2nd grade, where we would give the students a historical figure. They'd read and research about that historical figure and then generate a written piece about that character, but then also deliver that with oral communication skills. So we're seeing the use of up to 4 ELA standards where we're doing informational reading. We're using research indicators. We're using the writing informative pieces, and then oral presentation skills. So we have 4 ELA indicators tied to a social studies indicator. So I love the idea of doing a wax museum. But let's take a look here at a different example. This is a science example. So here we see informational writing again. Informational writing is always great, an easy way to tie into our content areas. This is a 1st grade example. We see asking and answering questions. And so I want to lean into that aspect of the research indicator, the asking and answering of questions. So not only are students having to answer questions in the research process, they have to learn how to develop questions, to ask them. Now, the science indicator that we're leaning into is the Earth and Space Science Indicator, and it is to use observations of the sun, moon, and stars to describe patterns that can be predicted. Now, I've said this before, oftentimes we cannot teach the full extent of our science, social studies, math, or other areas, indicators, but we can teach aspects of them. The aspect that we're leaning into in this example is going to be the moon. So I know that this indicator also includes the sun, it includes the stars, it includes patterns, but we are only leaning into the moon here. And then the overarching expectation is to create quality work. Now, quality work looks different, right? It doesn't have to be a produced, published piece of writing. Quality work can also be the example here of a scientific journal. A scientific journal. So let's take a look at what this bundling indicators project may look like. This is a moon project. I, as the teacher, gave my students 3 question stems: what, when, and where. Now, because the research indicator says that students have to ask and answer questions, I want my students to generate questions using the starter what, when, and where that would help them create a scientific journal about observing the moon. So what's a what question that students could ask about the moon? Well, what do you see? That's a great question they could ask. Then I want them to generate a question using when. What's a when question you could use for a scientific journal? Well, when are you observing? It would be important to know what time of night I'm observing the moon, right, from a scientific journal. And then where. I want the students to generate a where question. So where are you looking? Are you looking from your driveway? Are you looking from the baseball field? Are you looking from your apartment building where there's a lot of light interfering with what you're able to see? And then they would create a scientific drawing. So this would be creating that quality work. They produced scientific notebook based on those indicators. So we're tapping into all 4 of those expectations in this one project. Now, let's take a look at another example. Now, this is a social studies example. I love this project as well. We're using C7.1. Now, this is where we're doing oral presentation skills for 3rd grade. So they would need to be able to orally present information. Again, we're tapping into research 1.1 and 1.2, where they're going to be asking and answering questions, grouping findings from a provided source. The social studies standard for 3rd grade here that we're focusing on is investigate the cultural characteristics of places and regions around the world. The cultural characteristics of places and regions around the world. And then our overarching expectation here is to make inferences to support comprehension. Let's take a look at what this project may look like. In this project, we're going to pause her. Your students would read the book, My Food, Your Food. And now that's a multicultural text that presents information about the different cuisine or food around the world. Now, one of the indicator explanations in the social studies standards around this indicator says that this indicator prompts students to inquire about how geography influences cultural characteristics around the world, including cuisine. So for this project, students could read this text, be inspired to explore their culture, or you could assign a culture from around the world, and then students would be asked to present information about the cuisine of that culture. An easy way for students to tap into that expectation of the social studies indicator, but also really working on those research skills. Now, again, I want to look at that social studies indicator. Would this project, focusing on the food of certain cultures around the world, would that teach that social studies indicator down here to mastery? Or would that give us an access point to that indicator? It's just an access point, right? That's not the complete target or expectation of that indicator, but we are giving them a place to enter that information and giving maybe a way to begin those discussions that we can continue to have during our social studies time. All right. Now that we've looked at a few examples of projects, and I've seen some dropped into the chat too, so I love that. Thank y'all for sharing your expertise with us. I want you to do our pause and ponder, thinking about projects and bundling indicators. So in the chat, complete one of the following sentences. I changed my perspective about projects. In what way? I'm more aware of bundling using projects. In what way? Or I'm considering bundling using projects in this way. So go ahead and respond in the chat, and I'd love to see your answers. I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to take 2 minutes and let the chat populate. Brenna's probably laughing because my wait time is terrible, y'all. Ooh, if I was on the 4.0 rubric, yikes. You'd have to mark me down for that. Katie, I love your comment about the using projects as the culminating activity or using it as an access point to jump in and start their learning and engagement. That's a great point. This can be a place where we launch our information, right? And I love hearing that there are things that you did in the past that you want to revisit. That's the expertise toolbox of a great educator, right? That we go back to the things that we know that work for our students. And that we are not trying to teach the full extent of our science and social studies indicators, but we are giving students an access point and a touch point to build that background knowledge. Think about in those two projects that we explored a little more closely and deeply, how much background knowledge are you helping your students cultivate around the sun and the moon or around different cultures around the world. That's giving them contextualization skills that can really cross over. So awesome, awesome. We really struggled. I struggled to teach research on a consistent basis too. Oh, I love that, Amber. That's a great point. And you're not a one-to-one school, so how can you? What I love about our indicators is that for our, I think our kindergarten through second grade, that the research is from a provided source. So you get to control the sources that they are researching, right? And if they don't have that one-to-one capability to do research independently, what can you provide to them to foster that research? So I love that. And it's not just one more thing, but you see the intention behind the bundling. All right. Awesome. Now let's go to real world problem examples. Now, this picture on the left may be something that you have experience with, or it may be something I've seen mentioned a lot by our library media center teachers using escape room tasks. So that would be like giving students a problem and then having them have to solve that problem in order to complete the escape room. So that may be a scenario that you've seen used in classrooms. But I want to talk about a real world example that I participated in as a student. So in elementary school, when I was growing up, that's way back in the 90s, we had a project where we had to create an invention to solve a problem. And the invention that I created was a cupcake decorator machine. And so it would create or it would decorate cupcakes in a more automatic fashion. Now, I don't know that that would revolutionize or change the world. However, the problem that I solved integrated a lot of different subject areas. I had to use math to measure and figure out the dimensions of my machine. I had to use science to figure out the pulleys and the mechanisms that would be needed to create that. I had to write up a report of how to create it, a how-to of sorts. So I was creating, or I was engaging in a lot of different skill areas in that real world problem solving activity. Now let's take a look at another example. So this is a second grade example using measurement. And the measurement we're looking at here is with time. So for our ELA indicators, we have two. First, we have the ELA C 8.1, and that is the indicator that deals with having discussions and considering the ideas of others. So participating in discussions and talking through the ideas of others. For research indicators here, we're looking at research 1.1 and 1.2 again, asking and answering questions and sequencing information. But here, let's take a look at the math indicator. We're using analog and digital clocks to tell and record time in 5-minute intervals. Now, we will not teach the full extent of that math indicator. However, we will use some of that indicator in order to teach or in this problem that we're about to explore. And then our overarching expectation really aligns with C 8.1, where we're collaborating with others and using active listening skills. So the students are given a problem. They're given this table of information that has movie start times using analog clocks. Now, a lot of them haven't seen analog clocks in their natural life. So using these is kind of a way to ensure we're meeting that aspect of that math indicator. So with this information, we want them to research. Joe's birthday party is Saturday at 4. But we also want to go see a movie on Saturday too. Which of these movie times could we attend and make it to Joe's birthday party? So students could have this discussion. Well, the first one is 8 o'clock. Could we go to an 8 o'clock movie if the party's at 4? Certainly. But what we want students to do in their small groups is have a discussion on why we could see Shrek 4 or why we might not be able to. Could we see Toy Story 6 at 10? Well, that group may have a good discussion of, are we talking about 10 a.m. or 10 p.m.? Because if it's 10 p.m., my bedtime is 9 o'clock. I can't go see Toy Story 6, right? And then we could talk about Dogman. Dogman, well, that says that Dogman's going to be at 2 o'clock. Are we able to attend a 2 o'clock movie? Maybe, maybe not. If the party starts at 4, it better be a quick movie. What's the runtime of Dogman? Do we need to figure out how long the movie's going to be? So all of these would yield really good discussions from our small groups, and that would really lean in. Let's go back to those indicators of participating with peers and adults in structured discussions and the overarching expectation of collaborating with others and using active listening skills. It would require students to engage in those conversations in order to determine which movie they'd be able to go see. All right. Now let's take a look at another example. This is a music example. Now, if you've been with us before, you may have seen the activity or part of the activity that we're going to focus our attention on today. This is a 4th grade example, and we are looking at author's purpose and perspective. And I'm going to slow down just a little bit and talk about this indicator. For 4th grade, the expectation is that we will determine and explain how an author's purpose is conveyed through the author's perspective. So we're going to ask students to determine and explain why an author wrote something based on the perspective of that author. For research, we want them to focus on determining the credibility of a provided source. So we're going to look at the credibility of what the author says. The indicator that we're focusing on here is a general music indicator, which would be an expectation for elementary school. And it would be that I can demonstrate and describe the skills needed for careers in music. The overarching expectation here is making inferences to support comprehension. So students are going to be making inferences about careers in music. Now, the text that we're going to look at for this fourth grade bundling example is called Trombone Shorty. It comes from one of the instructional materials for fourth grade, and it is an autobiography by a trombone player named Trombone Shorty, written for children to inspire them to play the trombone, conveyed through explaining the author's experience as a student musician who then grew up to be a professional musician. So first, let's think about that AOR 5.2 indicator. The author's purpose here is to inspire others to become student musicians. His perspective is that he was a student musician who is now a professional musician. So we're hitting that AOR 5.2. Now let's go to that research 1.2, where we're looking at the credibility of a provided source. Is Trombone Shorty a credible perspective to write about this? Absolutely. He's a success story, right? He's a credible musician. Now we're going to think about the music expectation. The indicator for music was that I can demonstrate and describe the skills needed for careers in music. This is where we're going to employ the overarching expectation. After reading this text, I can infer some of the characteristics that may be necessary for being a musician, right? Maybe I noticed that he worked hard and practiced often. Maybe I noticed that he was devoted to his instrument. Maybe I noticed that he was committed to practicing with others. So what we would expect our students to do as a project is to create a job advertisement for band members that includes the skills needed for the job. So let's take a look at that. Here's a job advertisement example. After reading Trombone Shorty, thinking about his perspective and his purpose for writing, inferring what expectations would be needed to be a good musician, here's an advertisement for joining a band. Do you want to be a rock star? If you sing or play an instrument, this is your chance. But here's the part where they made those inferences. What are the requirements for a band member? They have to love music. They have to work well with others, be responsible. So students are using those ELA skills, accessing that music indicator, and then creating a project to meet the expectations. I love this example. Okay. All right. Now that we've looked at solving a few real-world problems or real-world situations, I want you to respond in the chat. Did anything in this section change your perspective about real-world problems and how to use those or how to bundle indicators to solve those? Are you more aware of anything, or are you considering trying something based on this section? Again, that was our section on using problems and real-world situations to bundle indicators. Kim, it's so good to see you. Yes, I love the creating their own inventions. And I feel like that lends itself well to fifth grade social studies as well, because you have a lot of inventors in that that historical period. So that would be a great, and that would also go to a theme, right? So you could be doing all three ways of bundling indicators. Oh, Davita, that's a great point too. Yes, those real world problems can be micro experiences. They don't have to be a huge extended project-based learning activity. Yeah, I was thinking about that as well with one of the STEM activities that we used to do with creating a bridge or creating a derby car. Those were like real world problems, but they were large scale, right? How can we do that on a micro or a smaller scale? Awesome. It doesn't have to be something elaborate. Okay. All right. Now that you've had a chance to explore and kind of think about the 3 different ways that we can bundle indicators, now it's time to try it. I'm sure you are tired of hearing me talk for the past hour and 5 minutes. So now it's your turn to get a chance to do this. In just a minute, Brenna's going to open up some breakout rooms. There'll be 6. And what we'd love for you to do in these breakout rooms, there should be about 4 or 5 of you in each room. On your note catcher, you're going to select one of the provided bundle indicator planning documents. And you can pick kindergarten through 5th grade. It does not matter. We'd love for you to open that up, read it, take a look at it. It's set up in the same format as the lessons that we've just explored together, with that 4 square of indicators up at the top, and then a thinking chart at the bottom. Well, what we'd like for you to do is discuss a project or problem for the students based on the indicators, and then add an overarching expectation that you could connect to it. So you'll discuss what kind of project or what kind of real world problem could you create for your students based on these indicators. Then we'd love for you to develop an instructional idea plan for that project based on your bundling, based on what that looks like. So I'm gonna open one of these up just so we can kind of see it. This is the kindergarten example. So when you open it up, it'll tell you what grade it is. It'll show you the indicators that I have chosen for you. So I've chosen C8.1 with having those discussions. I chose AOR 10.1 with describing the relationship between visuals and the text. And then I used a math indicator using creating sums of 10 objects. You can choose whatever overarching expectation you like, and then I want you to write down what's an instructional idea, either a project or a real world problem that you could create for your kindergarten students to explore in this bundled indicator setting. So you get to come up with the idea. Maybe it's something that you've done before. Maybe it's something that you've seen in classrooms that you've supported. But how could you bundle these indicators and an overarching expectation to create a experience for your students? All right. When we conclude this time, we will give you about 20 minutes to do this. We'd love for you to be prepared to share with the group. So each person or one person from every group gets to come back and share with us what you decided as a group. Okay? All right. Any questions before we send you to your breakout rooms? Awesome. Okay. Brenda, go ahead and open up the rooms and we'll take about 20 minutes. All right, now let's think about what would be next for us as educators. So your next step. I want you to consider how you could employ the idea of bundling indicators in the next few weeks or months. We know that you have part of a 9 weeks left where you could experience some bundling indicators with students, but then you also have an entire year to plan for this summer. Are there any ways that you could set aside some intentional time to plan for bundling indicators in the next few weeks or months? So use your note catcher to record your plans and your ideas. This is in box 5 of your note catcher. As you do that, we're going to move to some clarity and closure. On box 6 of your note catcher, you have the triangle, circle, and square reflection tool. What I'd like for you to do is to reflect in these 3 ways. For the triangle, what are 3 important ideas that you can take away from our session today? For our circle, what is still circling in your head, or what are you still trying to understand from our session together today? And then for our square reflection, what is something that squares up or matches up with your thinking and your values around bundling indicators for instruction? Go ahead and reflect in those 3 ways on your note catcher and drop one of those in the chat for me. I want to see your reflections. Brenna, I love that you dropped in one of those AI tools called Rewordify. So that's in the chat if you are interested in adjusting a text for your students. All right, go ahead and drop in those triangles, circles, or squares, whichever one. As you are dropping those in the chat, we will revisit our purpose today. Remember, we had 2 purposes. The first was to do some explore some research and evidence around bundling indicators to create those cross-content connections. And then we wanted to provide you with some instructional structures to support your bundling indicators. How did we do with meeting those purposes today? Hopefully, you see that we were able to provide you with a little research and evidence about why we bundle indicators, and then gave you some instructional structures of how to bundle some indicators. As we close out our time together today, Brenna's going to drop into the chat the link for our survey. If you'll fill out that feedback survey, this will be how we capture your feedback from our session today. What did you find relevant and actionable? What could you go and do tomorrow or next week with students and teachers? And how was this relevant? Is this relevant to what you are doing in classrooms across our state? Do you find relevance in the bundling of indicators? So give us some feedback on that. You'll also record your email address on that feedback survey. That will be how we communicate out your recertification credit. So make sure to type in that email address correctly so that we're able to get you your recertification credit. The title for today's session was Bundling Indicators for the Elementary Level. And again, my name is Mandy Hawker. I am so thankful for our time together today, all 1 hour and 50 minutes. If you will fill out that feedback survey, and then you are free to go. Brenna and Casey and I will listen and linger. If you have any other questions or feedback, we'd love to chat with you for the next 10 minutes. But thank you for spending your Wednesday morning with us. We hope you have a great week. Thank y'all so much. And thank y'all for dropping your feedback in the chat. This is super helpful. I appreciate that so much. That will be good for me to read back through. Don't forget to fill out that feedback survey. Does anybody have any questions?